The rain poured down relentlessly, drenching the city in a cold, unforgiving storm. The streets were nearly empty, except for the occasional car speeding past, eager to escape the downpour. Amidst the chaos, Emily pushed her old stroller along the sidewalk, struggling to shield both herself and her 4-year-old daughter, Lily, from the rain with a flimsy umbrella. Her worn-out jacket did little to keep her warm, and her shoes were soaked through. But she had no choice. She had just finished a long shift at the diner and needed to get home. As she hurried down the dimly lit street, she noticed an elderly man standing alone near a bus stop. He was drenched, his thin coat clinging to his frail frame. He looked lost, confused, and vulnerable. Something about him tugged at her heart. She could have walked past, pretending not to see him, but that wasn't who she was. Emily paused, glancing down at Lily, who shivered slightly but didn't complain. She crouched beside her daughter and spoke gently. "Sweetheart, can you wait here for just a moment?" Lily nodded, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. Taking a deep breath, Emily approached the man. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice kind but concerned. The man turned toward her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know where I am," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was trying to get home, but I must have taken the wrong bus. I can't remember." His words trailed off, and Emily's heart ached for him. It was clear he was disoriented, possibly dealing with memory loss. She knew what it was like to feel lost. Not in the same way, but lost in life, struggling to find a way forward. She glanced around, hoping to see someone else who might know him. But there was no one. The city had a way of making people invisible when they needed help the most. "Do you have a phone? Maybe someone you can call?" she asked gently. The man patted his pockets, but came up empty. "I don't know. I don't think so." Emily sighed. The rain continued to fall, and she knew she couldn't leave him there. He looked so frail, so alone. "Come with me," she said, making a quick decision. "Let's get you out of the rain. We'll figure this out." The old man hesitated for a moment. Before nodding slowly, Emily led him to the small bus shelter, where Lily sat patiently, her big eyes watching the man with quiet curiosity. "This is my daughter Lily," Emily said with a reassuring smile. "She's a little shy, but she's sweet." The man managed a small smile. "Hello, Lily." Lily looked up at him and then turned to Emily. "Mommy, he looks cold." Emily's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's kindness. She removed her scarf and gently wrapped it around the man's neck. "Here, this should help a little." The man's eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. Emily knew she couldn't just leave him there, but taking him home, that was a risk. Her tiny apartment was barely enough for her, and Lily. Still, something inside her told her that this was the right thing to do. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the last few crumpled bills she had. "Come on, let's find a place to get you warm," she said. Little did she know, the man she was helping wasn't just any elderly stranger. He was someone whose life had been shaped by wealth and privilege. Someone who had been searching for something far more valuable than money, and Emily, in all her struggles and kindness, was about to change both their lives forever. Emily led the elderly man to a small cafe down the street, one of the few places still open that late. The warm air hit them as they stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filling the space. Lily clung to Emily's hand, her eyes darting curiously toward the man as they found a seat in the corner. Emily carefully helped the man remove his wet coat before handing him a napkin to dry his face. A waitress came by, eyeing their damp clothes with mild concern. "Can I get you something?" she asked. Emily hesitated. Money was tight, painfully tight, but she couldn't let the old man sit there, cold and hungry. "Just a cup of tea for him, please," she said, pulling out a few crumpled bills from her pocket. The waitress nodded and walked away, and the man turned to Emily, his expression full of something she couldn't quite place. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Emily smiled, though she felt the exhaustion deep in her bones. "I know, but I want to." For the first time that night, he let out a small relieved sigh. "I don't know what's wrong with me. My mind feels cloudy. I was trying to get home, but I don't remember how I got lost." Emily frowned. She had seen her own grandfather struggle with memory issues before he passed, and she recognized the signs. "Do you remember your name?" she asked gently. The man thought for a moment. "Walter," he said finally. "Walter Reynolds." That name sounded familiar, but Emily couldn't quite place it. Maybe he reminded her of someone. "Do you have family? Someone who might be looking for you?" Walter's expression darkened. "I don't know. I had a son, but we haven't spoken in years. And my wife." His voice trailed off, and he looked away, the sorrow in his eyes unmistakable. Emily knew what it felt like to be alone, to feel forgotten. She worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her and Lily's heads, yet no one seemed to notice. No one cared how hard she fought every day. The waitress returned with Walter's tea, and Emily watched as he wrapped his trembling hands around the cup. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her was once one of the most successful businessmen in the city. She had no idea that Walter Reynolds was worth millions. But Walter had long stopped caring about money. He had spent his whole life chasing success, thinking wealth would bring him happiness. He had built an empire, but in the process, he had lost the people who mattered most. And now, in his old age, he found himself lost in more ways than one. "Where do you live, Walter?" Emily asked after a few moments. Walter looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I think it's a house, a big one, but I can't remember the address." Emily's heart ached for him. She knew she should call the police or a shelter, but something about leaving him with strangers didn't sit right with her. He needed someone who actually cared. She sighed and glanced at Lily, who was now doodling on a napkin with a borrowed pen from the waitress. The little girl had a way of seeing things for what they truly were, and right now, she looked at Walter with the same quiet kindness she always showed to those in need. "Mommy, can he come home with us?" Lily asked suddenly. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Honey, we don't have much space." "It's okay. I'll share my blanket," Lily said simply. Walter let out a chuckle, the first real smile on his face that night. Emily bit her lip, torn. She barely had enough for herself and Lily. Bringing a stranger into their tiny apartment was risky. But then she looked at Walter again. The loneliness in his eyes, the way he held his tea, like it was the only warmth he had left in the world. Maybe, just for tonight. With a deep breath, she made her decision. "All right," she said. "You can stay with us, just until we figure out where you belong." Walter looked at her in disbelief. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, let's get you somewhere warm." As they stepped back into the cold night, Emily had no idea that this choice, this simple act of kindness, would change everything. She had no idea that the man she was helping had the power to turn her life around. And Walter had no idea that, for the first time in years, he had finally found a reason to believe in people again. Emily and Lily walked alongside Walter through the quiet streets, their footsteps splashing in shallow puddles. The rain had eased, but the cold still lingered. Emily kept glancing at Walter, worried about how frail he looked. He walked slowly, as if every step took effort. When they reached Emily's apartment building, she hesitated for a moment. It wasn't much, just a tiny one-bedroom in an old complex with thin walls and a heater that barely worked. But it was home. She led them inside, flipping on the dim light in the living room. The space was small, with a second-hand couch, a stack of lilies, picture books on the floor, and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. But Walter didn't seem to mind. Instead, he took everything in with quiet appreciation. "You can take the couch," Emily said as she grabbed a blanket from the closet. Walter sat down carefully, his tired body sinking into the cushions. "You don't know how much this means to me," he murmured. Emily simply nodded. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." That night, as she lay in bed beside Lily, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Walter. Who was he really? Why had he been out there alone? And why did his name sound so familiar? The next morning, she found Walter sitting at the kitchen table, looking at a faded family photo he had pulled from his coat pocket. It was an old picture, the edges worn from years of being handled. Emily saw a younger version of Walter's standings, beside a boy who looked about 10 years old. "My son," Walter said quietly, his fingers tracing the child's face. "His name is David. I don't know if he'd even want to see me now." Emily's chest tightened. There was a sadness in Walter's voice that she recognized. It was the sound of regret. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Startled, Emily opened it to find two men in suits standing outside. One of them held up a photo. It was Walter. "We've been looking for him," the man said. "He's been missing since yesterday." Emily's stomach dropped. "Who are you?" The man sighed. "I work for his son, David Reynolds." The name hit Emily like a shockwave. David Reynolds, the billionaire, the man whose name was in every business magazine, who owned some of the biggest companies in the country. Walter Reynolds wasn't just any old man. He was the father of one of the wealthiest men in the city. Emily turned to Walter, who looked down, shame flickering in his eyes. "I never wanted him to find me like this," he said softly. The men explained that Walter had wandered away from his estate after a moment of confusion, something that had been happening more often lately. His son had been frantic, searching for him. Emily felt torn. Walter had seemed so lost, so lonely. She had assumed he had no one. But now, knowing that he was the father of a powerful millionaire, she didn't know what to think. Then, before anyone could say another word, a third figure appeared in the doorway. David Reynolds himself. He looked different from the boy in Walter's photo. Older, sharper, his suit pristine, his posture rigid, his eyes locked onto Walter. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David took a shaky breath. "Dad!" Walter looked up, guilt and hope battling on his face. "David, I didn't mean to worry you." David stepped forward, his voice quieter now. "Why didn't you call me?" Walter hesitated. "I thought maybe you didn't need me anymore." David's expression softened, and to Emily's surprise, she saw raw emotion in his eyes. "I've always needed you." The room was silent. Then, finally, David walked forward and wrapped his arms around his father. Walter let out a breath, as if he had been holding it for years. Emily watched, feeling a lump in her throat. She had expected a different kind of reunion. Cold, distant, but this was something real. David turned to her. "You helped him," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Emily just nodded. He needed someone. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. "I want to thank you. You don't know what this means to me." Emily glanced down at the check, her breath catching when she saw the number. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, enough to change everything for her and Lily. But after a long pause, she gently pushed the check back toward him. "I didn't do this for a reward." David looked at her, surprised. Walter, however, smiled. "She's special," he said. Emily gave a small shrug. "Just trying to do the right thing." David nodded, then reached into his wallet and handed her something else. A card with his personal number. "If you ever need anything," he said, "please call me." Emily hesitated, then took it. A few days later, Walter was back in his home, with the best care money could buy. But something had changed. David visited him every day now. The distance between them was finally gone. As for Emily, life continued. She still worked hard, still struggled some days, but things felt different. She had made a difference in someone's life, and somehow that made all the challenges feel lighter. One evening, as she sat with Lily reading bedtime stories, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "David Reynolds. I meant what I said. If you ever need help, you have a friend here." Emily smiled. Maybe things were finally looking up, and all because she had stopped in the rain that night, choosing kindness over indifference.